And that statement pretty much knocks everything that I had struggled with. Jealousy, insecurity, like everything. It's not about you. Well, if it's not about me, then it's irrelevant if I'm jealous or insecure. Like, it just doesn't matter.
Wow.
So yeah, it was just pretty cool. Just like such a shift. It was so evident in my mind, like, oh, it's Christ in me. Like, he lives in me for a reason.
Welcome to this week's episode of the His Hill Podcast. My name is Kelly Doherty, and I'm your host. Today, I have with us an alumni. This is Morgan Muyres, who is from Florida, and she was a student with us just a couple of years ago. She was back it was the beginning of this summer for a visit when we were celebrating a wedding, and she actually sat in on one of the interviews. I asked if she would be willing to be interviewed. She was a little hesitant, as most people are, but then was willing to do so after praying about it and talking with her parents. So we now have with us Morgan. And so, Morgan, welcome here.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you. I appreciate you giving us this time. I know you have a busy day, so you gave me a couple of times at work, and this was one of them, and I almost blew it because I got here, I got everything set up, and then realized I forgot the SD card for recording. Had to run back to the house, but you were willing to wait, and I appreciate that. So,
yeah, of course.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Morgan. Did you grow up in Florida?
Yes, I did. I grew up in Florida, lived in the same neighborhood my whole life, same church, born and raised. A pretty classic childhood. Both of my parents are believers, and they've raised me and my family up in that way, encouraging us towards the Lord as we grew. So
okay,
yeah.
So what then? What was it like? Like, were you homeschooled? Did you go to public school, private school?
Yeah, I was public schooled all of my schooling years.
Okay.
Which was very interesting.
Okay. Tell us about it.
Yeah. I think that in elementary school, it was pretty like classic elementary school, but the older that I got, the more interesting the years went on. Middle school was pretty wild, but it was still really good. And then high school was probably my toughest time, just from a lot of I don't know, there was very little believers at my school, and those who claimed to be believers did not act like it.
Okay.
So I felt pretty alone there.
Okay. Well, let's back up then a little bit and just find out, in growing up, do you guys live near a beach?
I live 45 minutes to an hour from a beach, but most of my friends live 30 minutes, so I just drive to them and then they take me the rest of the way.
Okay, so then your area is kind of humid, I would expect, because you're Florida and not that far from the beach. Yeah, okay, yeah. Well, you and I have that in common. I grew up in South Louisiana, about 12 miles from the coast. And it's just, it's like living in a shower all year long.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And, people don't understand that. They think, it's not that hot there. The temperatures don't get that higher than 90. Yeah, but you add that, you put that along with, from 80 to 90% humidity. And, people have no idea what that feels like. So, and you and I were just laughing, too, that we both have had some time this summer in Washington. You were spending some time with relatives up there, and so were we. We flew into Seattle and went to British Columbia, but the same area. And we were just laughing how it was just last week it was 70 degrees, and and it just felt incredible. Then you come back here and it's, oh my goodness. Of course, here at His Hill, people complain about the humidity, but you probably didn't find it that big of a deal, did you?
It was so dry.
That's how I feel. People have to tell me it's humid today, and I think about it, go, yeah, you're right, it is a little humid, isn't it? Because you just don't naturally feel it here. But yeah, okay, so you grew up in that humidity, but I got another question for you. Did you notice it as being that humid until you had gone away and then come back?
Yeah, I mean, my family, we love to travel, so I think I would get used to it, and then we would leave, and I would be like, oh, wow, my hair isn't like a giant fuzzball. And then I'd go back home, and I was like, oh, yeah, that's why.
Yeah.
Nothing like stepping out of the airplane into like just the bridge, and the air is so wet you have to chew it before you can breathe it. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, that was for me. I grew up for years in Louisiana, and then we'd travel out, and I always thought it was comfortable, never thought that much about it. But it was when I spent a couple of years away and then moved back, I realized, oh my goodness, this is what I had become acclimated to, growing up, and just thought this was normal. Okay, so we have that in common, growing up in the South with the humidity. Now, with that too, I grew up in a Christian home as well, and also grew up, where the younger years were fine, but by the time you get to high school, it was different. There's just not that many. I grew up in public school. There just were not that many believers in the school, and then again, like you said, those who profess to be believers in Christ, that you wouldn't know unless you happen to see them at church, some church event, and then they tell you they're a believer. And and I have to confess that for myself, that was true as well. I felt like I was, I felt like I was, being, showing myself to be a believer. And it was a couple of podcasts ago, I actually told the story that, I didn't realize, that I was hiding my faith. I didn't realize it until I was asked to join a Christian band. I walked into the first rehearsal, and the band members looked at me in shock. And some of the others the guy that asked me to join it, he knew that I was, but these other guys were in shock when I walked in. These were guys that I knew from school, and their question to me was, "Are you a Christian?" And I was just, in shock, because it's not so much that I was doing bad things. I just wasn't living out the life of Christ. And, but we can fool ourselves like that. So I have to put myself in that boat, where there's, professing believers who just weren't showing that they were. Now, before we get to that, your high school years, tell us about those younger years. Growing up in a Christian family, when did you become a Christian?
Yeah, so every summer, my church has their own version of a VBS called Power Up Clubs. I was 9 years old at a Power Up Clubs, and it was during snack time, where one of the team members shares their testimony in the gospel. And she shared her testimony, and I thought it was super awesome. This girl was so cool. And then during snack time, she came and sat by me and just started asking me questions. Just, where do I stand with the Lord? Like, what do you believe? And I realized I had never become a Christian. I'd never made that step myself. Even though I knew all the answers, I knew the gospel. It wasn't new news to me, but it just was this realization of like, oh, I would not go to heaven if I died on my way home from here. And that night, I don't know, it makes me chuckle. This is just like a glimpse of how emotional I am. I was laying in bed and had my mom come and join me, and we talked about it, and I decided that I wanted to pray and accept Christ as my savior. And I laid there and cried for like 5 minutes before I even prayed. My mom was like, so are you going to pray or are you just going to cry? But I was just so excited and just like so overwhelmed by like the love that the Lord had for me, that he would save me from hell. And just as 9 years old, I was able to wrap my mind around that. And yeah, so I guess going from there, like the biggest thing that changed after that was there was no longer this fear of death or like an unknown after my time on earth kind of thing.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. No, that's good. And so how did that, how did that affect the rest of your childhood as you look back?
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up in an amazing church. And so all of a sudden church shifted somewhat from a time to be with my friends to like, oh, I get to learn about Jesus. And I think that that was one of the coolest changes to see. And of course, there were like waves of that where it was like some seasons it was super like, I just want to know more about Jesus. And some seasons was, what am I going to do after church with my friends kind of thing. But it was just cool to see the Lord's faithfulness there. And yeah, speaking truth to me, even when I wasn't necessarily there to hear it.
Okay, good. And as far as your middle school years before high school, how did you walk with the Lord? What did that look like?
Yeah, so at church, I would say it was amazing. Like, it was just a time of a lot of growing in my life. There was a lot of encouragement from my leaders in different like small groups that I was in to be in the Word daily, and there was massive accountability there. And then there was lots of challenging to be bold in my faith at school, and just like encouragement to go and tell someone about Jesus. Go tell someone your testimony tomorrow at school. Like, just to not shrink back out of fear or just sit in comfortability on the bus, but rather make conversation. So I think that that was pretty common throughout the 2 years of my middle school. And yeah, I think that I can see, looking back, that there was a lot of like a sense of like obligation in my heart, not to the Lord, but to my leaders, of like wanting to be in the Word so that I would please them, and wanting to tell people about Jesus so that I would please my leaders. And so basically that I could check the box that I did it this week's homework.
Right.
So that was interesting, but I also can say that the Lord didn't waste that at all. Like, just different conversations that I had with friends at school, seeing lives change and seeing the Lord just give me peace in conversations with friends and people who weren't my friends, who would just like ask me about Jesus. Like, what? But it was really cool. So yeah, I guess middle school is interesting in the sense of like wanting to please the Lord, but also wanting to please the leaders in my life, and just kind of like an interesting dance there throughout the years.
Okay. Yeah. You know, that it makes me think of things like where Jesus says, and I believe he's talking about unbelievers, non-believers. But, you know, where he says, you know, that there'll come a time when people will say to me, you know, that, but Jesus, we prophesied in your name, we healed in your name, you know, and they go on all these list of things that they've done in his name. And he says to them, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. But he says, I never knew you. And I've always thought that, you know, if a non-believer can do things, good things, even though they say it's in the name of Jesus, it's not of him. If the non-believer can accomplish good things, then certainly the believer in himself can accomplish good things. And and that's a dangerous place to be, because we start to find our identity and try to find our satisfaction from our good things that we're doing for the Lord. And so sometimes even trying to please other people for good. You know, it's not that we can't always do these things, but there's never that. But that's it. And though the Lord may use those things, I think we miss out on what the Lord is wanting to do in our heart with those things. And so, you know, maybe that's kind of what you're describing here.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So did that ever come to a point where that it became frustrating for you to live? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure. Yeah. I just remember like walking up to my school bus and just feeling this like weight of like, I have to tell someone about Jesus, but I don't know who, I don't know how, I don't know. And so I'd sit there and I would just think and try to formulate the most perfect questions to ask that would lead me to this perfect conversation. And it was just all out of my own strength, and it was just exhausting. But every time that the Lord did something, it was like, oh, okay, Lord, like you're still working here. Like it's not me. So it was a constant, like I could see that the Lord was working, but I was also trying to make him work.
Okay. Yeah. I understand that. Yeah. You know, I grew up much the same way, you know, if I with a checklist, type of lifestyle. These are the things that I have to do as a believer. And so I would engage in those things, and I would pray about those things, but I can remember being worn out and frustrated at times. So you went on to high school, and what was that like now?
Yeah, high school I think was the first couple of years was pretty lonely. Like I mentioned, my friends live pretty far away from me. My community is like 30 minutes away, which isn't that bad, but when you can't drive, it's quite the struggle.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I went to a different school than my community, and oftentimes wasn't able to hang out with them as often as I wanted to. And so I got into this pretty rough habit of just like being at school, coming home, sleeping. And then I'd wake up and do homework, have dinner, and go to bed. And that was just like this cycle of like, I didn't even want to have to do anything. And then once I started working, I added work into there. And every once in a while I'd end up at church. But yeah, so I think that there was just quite an interesting cycle of I desire to be with this community of believers, but it's hard for me to get there. And so I'm just not going to try.
Okay. So now you said that once in a while you'd find yourself at church. You're talking about extra events besides Sunday, or were you starting to not go to church that much?
No, I definitely never stopped going to church because my parents served in my high school ministry as well. And so it was never a question of, are we going to go to church tonight? Like, we were going. Yeah. There were seasons where I was there, but I wasn't.
I got you.
Like, I would sit in the back, or I would stay with this one person, and it was just not, I wasn't there to serve. I was there to be served. And when that didn't happen, I left disappointed.
Okay. That's funny. My parents were also involved in the youth, and they were the cool parents. Of all the parents to have, I had the cool parents. And so they were always involved in the youth activities. They were youth sponsors. They were on all the mission trips, and they were always around. And, I look back on it now, and I'm very thankful. That's the kind of parents I had, that they, it's not that they were keeping an eye on me. They were involved. And when we went places, they weren't watching me like a hawk either. It's just, they were involved, and they were serving the Lord, and they were an incredible example to me, and they were an incredible example to the kids, the rest of the kids. And, but so I can picture that, you're there, but you don't want to be there, but you're there because those two people are here and there's no getting around it. But I can look back on it, and I'm really thankful for that, that the Lord gave me those kind of parents.
Yeah, for sure. I think at first I was like, I just want my own space. And then like friends would come over and they would sit down and talk to my mom for an hour and a half. And I'm like, are you serious? But in that, I was able to see like, oh, she's wise. Like, oh, she actually is able to point them to Jesus. Like, she's worth knowing.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that was a sweet shift to see. And now my mom is probably one of my best friends. But yeah, I also don't want to downgrade my time in high school at church. I definitely had some solid friends who were consistent to remind me of Jesus. Yeah. And even when they left for college, they were consistent to remind me of Jesus. And so it was just what I did with that reminder.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, tell us about it. Tell us about how that, how things started to work out. You're going, you're not always there, even though you're there. And you're wanting to be served instead of served. So what did the Lord do with your heart with all this?
Yeah, I think, as I was looking back, there were certain things that were very like prevalent. And I think that jealousy was one thing. And a lot of it was just based on my location, and that it was hard for me to go and hang out with friends. And so that was like, I was just very jealous that like my friends were able to always be together and I was stuck in a bubble, and I also think that the jealousy led into insecurity of like, oh, maybe they don't want me to hang out with them. And maybe it's not that I'm far away, but it's that they don't want to invite me and things like that. So it just like opened the door to like a whole new struggle and different things to walk through. And then on top of it all, I'm just quite the emotional person. If you know me, like I feel big feelings and I feel them often. And at the time in high school, that felt more like a curse than a blessing. And so I had all of these emotions that I was feeling, and they were big and they were often, and I didn't know what to do with them. And so I think that welcoming in some like mentors and some leaders into my life to help speak into that changed things. It was like night and day at times. It was still quite the roller coaster, but I can just see how the Lord would remind me of like, it's not about you, or the Lord has created you this way, or I don't need my friends to be close to know the Lord. Just lots of like little reminders that the Lord brought to me through different people and different conversations that I can see how all put together. He was gently pushing me to himself in that time of like loneliness and jealousy and insecurities and big emotions. Like no one else could tend to that the way that the Lord could.
Okay. So, tell us, just how did the Lord bring you to that? And what kind of changes did you start to see in your heart?
Yeah, I can't think of like a specific moment that the Lord brought me to that. I think it was often conversations with like different mentors in my life where they would just remind me of truth and remind me of the same truth a million times, which I was always annoyed at. But looking back, I'm like, well, yeah, that's what I needed to hear. So yeah, I can't think of a specific moment, but I don't think that answered your question.
No, you did. That's fine.
Okay.
That doesn't have to be a specific answer to these questions, so don't worry about that. Okay, so that was your high school years, and did they finish well?
Yes, I definitely think they finished well. Once I started driving, I had a little bit more freedom to be able to go and meet up with friends, and that changed a lot of things because then it was like they actually do enjoy being with me. Like, that's fun. Rather than just like this massive insecure bubble. But I also think as I was leading up to Bible school, I had a lot of like, what if I'm not good enough to be at Bible school? What if I don't know enough about Jesus to be at Bible school? And so, I think I left high school with a little bit of fear looking into the next season, but also with just a lot of excitement and eagerness to see what the Lord had in store. Okay.
Well, what about Bible school? How did you end up coming to His Hill?
It's actually kind of a funny story. Like, throwback to 7th grade, Charlie came and taught at one of our Bible intensives, and 7th grade Morgan was sitting there listening to him convince a senior to come to His Hill. And he convinced me. And so I went home that night and was like, Mom, I know what I'm doing after high school. And she was like, okay. So for all of those years, there was no doubt in my mind that I wasn't going to be at His Hill when I graduated.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. So you applied then after high school? Did you apply before you actually graduated?
I applied as soon as the applications were open.
Yeah. Okay. Which was probably, let's see, that you were a student here in 22?
Yes.
Okay. So that by then I think we were starting to fill up early. So, you probably applied during school. During high school. Okay. Well, good. And then you got here. What was His Hill like? What were your first impressions had you been here before? Had you been on campus before?
Yes, I came and visited. I had a friend who was here previously, and so me and my mom came in, did a little taste and see while she was here.
Okay.
Which was really sweet.
Okay.
Hooked me even more.
So tell us about now. You came to His Hill when you first showed up as a student. What were your first impressions as a student coming on campus?
I felt like it was just like magical. Like, I just loved every second of it. From the start, I was sad to see my parents go, but I was so excited to meet these people who were everywhere around me, and just the whole idea of it and everything that I had heard from my friends, and just like the anticipation since 7th grade. It was like, oh, it's finally here now. Like, it's my turn. And it felt like community immediately clicked. I got super close with a couple of girls, and it was just really good. Community was just amazing from the start.
Good.
Yeah.
And what were some things the Lord did in your heart?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest moments was in your Genesis class, which I feel like you hear that often, but yeah, so in your Genesis class, it just clicked, Christ in you. It felt familiar in the sense of like the church that I had grown up in said, like, preached the same thing, but it had never clicked to me until I was sitting there, and you just very clearly were like, it's not about you. I was like, oh. And that statement pretty much knocks everything that I had struggled with. Jealousy, insecurity, like everything. It's not about you. Well, if it's not about me, then it's irrelevant if I'm jealous or insecure. Like, it just doesn't matter.
Wow.
So yeah, it was just pretty cool. Just like such a shift. It was so evident in my mind, like, oh, it's Christ in me. Like, he lives in me for a reason, not just to like check the box of being a Christian, but to like live through me. And that just like excited me. It lit a flame that had never been lit before. And I didn't fully understand it, but I knew that it was true, and I was excited to learn more.
You know, that's interesting. I too grew up in a church that preached Christ is your life, and I didn't hear it either. You know, and our pastor was very clear on a weekly basis with that. And then I heard Major Thomas. He would bring. Actually, our pastor brought Major Thomas in, and I heard him preach several times. And I can remember sitting in the balcony listening to him and thinking, "This is really good, but I don't know why this is so good." and then I was a camper at his hill, and I heard the same thing, and I said the same thing. This is really good. Don't know why, but it's good. And then I was a student, and I said the same thing. And it wasn't until after I had left his hill and had finished Bible college that I came to hear what I was being told. And but my point with that is that, you know, it's interesting because you say you had heard this, but it wasn't until you came to Bible school in the Genesis class that you heard what was being said. And a friend of mine used to say this, that the life of Christ, the truth of him living in us is not, and he's pretty funny, guys, and he would say it's not taught, it's caught. And what he meant by that is that it's not until your heart is ready to hear that you will hear. And the Lord is faithful to bring your heart to where you're ready to hear. So are we going to fight him? Are we going to walk with him? Are we going to, yield and allow him to bring us to that point where we're ready to hear? And I think it's a testimony to the Lord and his patience in us. And the reason I'm making a point about this is a lot of people that we've interviewed, a lot of our alumni have said the same thing, are similar to the same thing. And I don't want people listening to this to think that this is an academic achievement that you, me, or anyone else has attained to. But it's the reality that is ours as we've come under the Lord and allowed him to do what only he can do. And that's show himself in our lives and make himself known. And, I appreciate, you pointing that out, that, these are things you've heard, but it wasn't, and he even said it like this, for some reason, it just made sense then. And, that reason is Jesus himself, that he revealed himself yet again, just continuing to show himself to you. And at that point, he had faithfully brought you to a place where, boom, you could say, I see. I see you showing yourself to me, and it's of no merit of my own. It's what you're doing, And,
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that. So, you explaining that. Now, so that's happened in the beginning of the school year. And you sat in the front all year, didn't you?
I tried my hardest to.
Yeah, it seems like I remember that. And because you're one of those students that you can tell that it's just engaged. You're listening and you're eating it up. So tell us what was going on. I mean, you hear this early in the year, and now and this was the Genesis class is the first week, the first full week of classes. So that's just the beginning of the year. What did the Lord do with this?
Yeah, I think that it's one of those things that I never stopped learning, and I still haven't stopped learning, just like what that means on a day-to-day life. And there was part of me that was like, am I going to get tired of hearing this every day? And I didn't. Like, it just excited me all the more every time I heard it's Christ in you. Every time. It was just like, oh, you're right. Like, why did I wake up this morning thinking that I could do it on my own? And I think that something that was so sweet throughout the year was seeing my friends come to that realization as well. And to see a change in their life, like a tangible change, was just so encouraging. And to hear them say the same to me was just like, wow, this is sweet. This is different. Yeah, I think that that's one big thing that I hope to never forget about my year at Hill.
Okay. You say that something in the conversations is that, you hear them say, yeah, this is different. What's so different?
Yeah, I think that it's just, I don't even know how to explain it. It's just different. Like, it was just evident that people weren't living to please themselves. And that in conversation, they weren't just looking to point it back to them and the good that they've done. Or, it was just so evident of their love for the Lord and their love to let the Lord, or their desire to let the Lord shine through them. And just like every little thing, from different conversations in the dining hall and different like debates of different opinions and whatnot, it was just so evident of the Lord and just grace to one another. And there was just very little bitterness or strife in our year. And I just think that's evident of the Lord living in and through us.
Yeah.
Because you put a ton of sinners on a hilltop and you expect just chaos, but it wasn't. It was just like beautiful.
Yeah, that's that's really well said. I think you hit the nail on the head. Christ, we look in the Gospels and we see that Christ lived a life here on earth that was not about himself, but it was all about others. And he said, the things I say, I don't even say in my own initiative. The things I do, I don't say on my own initiative. These are the things I hear my Father say. These are the things I see my Father do. And then he goes, and if anybody who has a hard time saying that Jesus, wasn't living for himself, well, he hung on the cross and died for us, and how this is true of the life of Christ. And so if what we're saying is this person now lives in me, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, Galatians 2:20, then doesn't it make sense that he's going to show himself as he already has shown himself to be about others and not about himself? So we're not going to live a life that's about me, but it's about others. And, I think that's an incredible explanation that, the description you just gave of the student body, just full of people that were no longer living selfishly, were no longer living about themselves, but were really giving grace to one another, and were living in a way that was really of concern and care for others. And I think that is a beautiful description of Christ. And I think you nailed it right on the head. So now throughout that year, now you stayed for summer that year, didn't you?
Oh yeah.
Okay, well, what was that like? After 9 months of pretty intense Bible study, people don't understand. I've said it several times on the podcast, but Bible school at His Hill it is. People often think, oh, you went to Bible school, so they think of it as something like a glorified vacation Bible school. But it's you actually get more Bible in your 9 months at His Hill than you would in 4 years in a Bible college, because that's pretty much all we're doing. We're studying the Bible 5 hours a day. And, we bring in guest lecturers from all over the world to go along with our residence teachers who are here throughout the year teaching different courses. So, that's pretty intense. Now, before I ask you about how that, is transitioning into summer, since I brought all of that, what was that like to be in class for 5 hours a day with, studying the Word and, it's doing your homework and what was that like for nine months?
Yeah, I loved it. I remember at the end of the year wishing that we didn't have to stop and knowing that there was more there that we didn't get to, that I wish that we could have just sat down and dived into and to look back and know that I missed so much, even though I was sitting there listening. Can I just go back and listen to every single lesson all over again? I think that it just excited me. And yeah, I just think I fell in love with the Word in a different way than I had before.
Okay. So after that, then, 9 months of that, then everything on the property undergoes a drastic change. And it happens in 2 days. We finish up on usually a Thursday night is when we finish, I think. And then everybody that's coming for camp comes back on Sunday, and it's different. I mean, starting Monday morning, everything's different. There's all these people that come onto the hilltop that you don't know, but they know the hilltop. And in some cases, they even know things you don't know about the hilltop. I mean, every year that happens, and you've got to deal with that. Like, who are these people? And, they're people that have been part of summer camp for years. And, they've been students and now they're returning for another year of camp. So, you had to go through that adjustment. Some of your friends have left. They didn't stay for camp, and some have stayed, and you've got now you're back in the dorm, but it's different. There's different people in the dorm. You may have different roommates. What were the first couple of days like for you with that change?
It was honestly very hard. Staying for camp itself was very hard for me. I did not want to, at all. And I said no for a very long time to Connor over and over again. And there was one day that it was just so evident that the Lord would have me stay for camp, unmistakable. And so I went to Connor and I said, I'm signing up. And he was like, you're joking? I was like, I'm not. I'm signing up. There's probably tears in my eyes.
Oh, wow.
And so all of a sudden, half of my friends are gone and there's new people, like you were saying. And it was just difficult. My family was in town and it felt like 1,010 different things that I was trying to process all at one time while trying to wrap my head around camp. Those first few days were very difficult for me. Okay.
And okay, so how did the Lord deal with that in your heart?
Yeah. I guess moving into camp, again, it was still very difficult. And I remember laying there my first night and looking at the top of the bunk and thinking, what am I doing? Why am I here? How am I supposed to do this for another, 10 weeks? And I just remember very, gently, my mind just shifted to, this is what they've been saying all year. I'm not the one doing this. I just need to be available to the Lord. And it was just insane, the amount of peace that was brought in that moment. And I had that moment probably 1,000,000 times over the course of the summer as I tried to pick it back up into my own hands and feel all of the fears and anxieties and all of the things. And then the Lord just gently redirecting my heart to, it's not about you. You don't have to do it. It's me. Just be available to me, and putting it back down and seeing him work. So it was just this constant cycle.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because that's been our encouragement, throughout the year for students to stay. Not that every student has to stay or is supposed to stay, but our invitation to them is to stay, because we've seen the Lord do this. I can't tell you how many students have told us that summer camp was the perfect ending to their school year. And I think it's interesting because it's not really part of the school year, but it was the perfect ending because it was a practicum for all that they had been taught the 9 months before, that this is not about me. This life is about Christ, and I can trust him for it. And incredible things happen, during the summer, that he uses in ways that we know that was not me, because I cannot do that. So was that basically your experience throughout the summer?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think that the Lord was just so gracious and deepening friendships that I hadn't even really had before. Like, we spent the whole year on the hilltop together, but all of a sudden we're in the fire together, and our friendship just shifted, and it was just such a sweet change. And so that was just by the grace of the Lord, and a good gift that I still thank him for. But I also loved our time during counselor meetings and just different devos, just hearing counselors' hearts in the midst of hard, and just different sayings that we had throughout the summer, like prayer works and things that sounded lighthearted, but we knew oh, this is a time to rely on the Lord in a serious way and in such a tangible way. We can't do this. I wake up in the morning, I can't do this. I don't want to get out of my bed, but I have a girl who has to go to the bathroom, so it's time to go. So yeah, I think that it was just so sweet, so hard, but so sweet, just to see the Lord bring different truths to mind that were so applicable in this season, and how he's prepared my heart for going home in that season. And yeah, just lots of different things.
Well, good. That's neat. That's encouraging to hear. So now you did you did that one summer and you went home. How are things going now for you?
Yeah, I think coming home initially was like whiplash. I was on just this amazing high, leaving summer camp, just knowing the Lord's faithfulness and seeing him work through me in such tangible ways. And then coming home, I just kind of fell on my face a little bit. I was on fire for the Lord. I was so excited to share with my friends of what I had learned, but it was different. I kind of came home expecting it to be the same as the hill, but it wasn't. And friendships looked different, and my time at church looked different. And in the past year, I had friends who left, and friends who came, and friends who changed, and I changed. And it was just a whole new ball game of trying to figure out where was my place in the college ministry, and where do I want to serve, and all of these new distractions coming up. Well, now there's a TV, and now I have to make my own food. And just lots of little things that all distracted me from the Lord. And so I think right away it was just I'm choosing to go downstairs and watch TV before I am to read my Bible. And just little things like that just kind of robbed, just kind of snuck in, small things that snuck in that stole my eyes from the Lord and put them on things of the world. And so I think I can look back now and see how the Lord has just been so gracious and patient with me in that, to just gently remind me of my need for him. And yeah, I think another fear in coming home was that I would lose touch with a lot of my friends who had become so important to me at the Hill. And the Lord, again, has been just so gracious to continue to deepen those friendships, not just to keep them afloat, but to deepen them and to continue to walk alongside each other in life. And so I think that has been one of the greatest blessings in coming home, is to have friends who are going through the same transition. Maybe they're across the world, but they are also feeling the same feels that I am, and they might have a different truth to apply that have been helpful to me. So yeah, that's probably one of my first thoughts about that there.
Okay, good. Well, Morgan, I appreciate you being willing to do this. And I didn't say anything in the introduction about it. I'm pretty sure it's obvious to people that, we're not in the same room, that because of the recording, you're on the phone. And that's not always the easiest way to conduct an interview, but this has been great. It's there's been no issue with it at all. I think it's been a very easy conversation. But I thank you for doing that, because you're in a room, we don't see each other, we just hear voices. But you've been willing to do that, and I appreciate it very much. Just want to thank you for spending the time, for answering the questions. And, Morgan, I want to thank you for being clear on pointing us back to Jesus. And that's really what we want to encourage people with.
Yeah, of course. I think that this podcast has been such a ministry in my own life as well, and coming home and hearing once again, like, Christ in you, it's not about you, has been such an encouragement, and not being at the hill, but to still hear that truth time and time again. So I appreciate you in this ministry too, Kelly.
Well, praise the Lord. Well, Morgan, have a great day. And I know, the Lord keeps bringing you around, so I'm sure we'll see you again soon.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the His Hill podcast. You've been listening to our host, Kelly Doherty, and Morgan Muyres, a His Hill alumna from the 22-23 school year. We are in our last week of having elementary campers, and will switch to welcoming junior high and high schoolers for the next 3 weeks of camp starting this Sunday. This summer hasn't been as blazing hot as it normally is, and we have had some rain the last few weeks, which has been a huge gift to our summer staff and our grass. Please keep praying for everyone here, that we would glorify the Lord in all that we do. Once again, thank you for joining us this week for another episode of the His Hill podcast. Remember to keep your eyes fixed on Christ. I'm Lizzie, and we'll see you next week.